Okay, that's self-disclosure. The next thing, slide number 7, communication confidence. Again, there's a lot of this section is basically more, it's basic information about communication confidence as a construct rather than using it or applying it to CMC, though they do that a little bit later. They offer several different, I've already talked about what competence is. They do define it as the notion of communication competence. This is on the top of page 83. Is described as a person's ability to demonstrate skills, either innate or developed, to accomplish communicative goals, to choose among available communicative behaviors, the attempt to accomplish interpersonal goals during an encounter while maintaining the face and line. Face being your own self-presentation. You don't want to lose face. You want people to see you as good. A fellow interacts within the constraints of the situation. Moreover, communication competence describes the evaluative impression of the quality of interaction. So basically, it's the larger big thing. How strategic are you in the process of communicating? How do people perceive you, etc., etc., etc. And there are various criteria here. One is competent communicators are clear. So you want to make what you want to convey clear to others so they get what it is that you're trying to say. Again, I would say, whether face-to-face or CMC, unless you're strategically trying not to be clear, which also can be strategic. The second is this idea of, are you satisfied at the end of the encounter? So did it do what you wanted it to do? Do you feel some sort of fulfillment in the interaction, whatever the interaction might be? The next, or the third criteria of this larger idea of communication competence is the competent communicator is efficient. That is, the competent communicator selects the most strategic or the best tools or the best channels or mediums, whatever you want to call them, to use to convey such and such a message. Should I do this face-to-face? Should I do this via email? Should I do this on Facebook? Should I do this? What's the best way to convey that information? The next is this idea of, well, I actually skipped one. Hold on a second. I'm sort of redoing the PowerPoint as I'm going through this. After efficient is actually effective. So effective is basically the fourth criteria. So the competent communicator is effective. So you actually accomplish the goals that you wanted to accomplish. You wanted to persuade such and such student to work harder. She starts working harder. It is effective. Or you want to talk to a friend you've been having some problems with. You have a little chat and things are better. Hug and everything's wonderful. It has been effective. So. The next is the situation stuff. So the communication, or the competent communicator, adapts to the situation. So what are the appropriate communication strategies? That's why oftentimes we have to understand these various goals, or these various, not goals, but these various norms of what is appropriate, because a lot of folks don't think it's appropriate to break off a long-term committed romantic relationship online. Or think of a lot of this stuff is sort of the same if you've taken Comm 100, or just sort of adapting to the audience and adapting to the situation. At Columbia College, though, chapel is no longer required. Still, some folks go to chapel, but nobody wants to hear a speech at chapel that's 50 minutes long. We don't have time, but it's just You always have to be what's appropriate to the situation. And then, so in other words, the competent communicators can sort of read what is appropriate given the situation, and adhere to it. And then the final thing, this idea, the competent communicator is ethical. And basically that means, you can call it sort of a moral code, but what they say here envisions a world in which ideal speech situations could empower all and provide respect and voice to each person regardless of station or stereotype. So it's truly sort of an appreciation for other people, and that everybody's voice is equal, and you should allow other people to be heard just as they should allow you to be heard. It sort of goes against this idea of ethnocentrism, which is thinking sort of your way or your cultural way is the best way. It goes against the idea of egocentrism, which is like my way or the highway. So theoretically, generally speaking, the confident communicator knows how to make things clear. The competent communicator seems to be satisfied with the interactions. The competent communicator is efficient in picking the best sort of channels to communicate. If you were talking about this in rhetorical terms, Aristotle said that rhetoric, if you have ever taken any of my rhetoric classes, is the art of finding in any given situation the available means of persuasion. So in light of the situation, what are my best opportunities to persuade others? And that's sort of what efficient is. The competent communicator is actually effective, so whatever your goal was, you got it done, get her done. The competent communicator understands the situation and sort of the norms of what's appropriate in those particular situations, what's appropriate communication in those particular situations. And the competent communicator is ethical and truly appreciates other people, and does not appreciate him or herself too much. Again, they don't say a whole lot about CMC here. They sort of imply, though, this idea that in contemporary society, being a competent communicator must include understanding the opportunities that CMC affords us. We cannot, I would argue, be competent communicators nowadays without considering what CMC offers us. When should we use CMC? When should we use face-to-face? When should we use both? How do all those choices that we make impact our own self-concept, our self-esteem, self-presentation, impression management, our relationship with other people, etc., etc., etc. So that's the basic idea. We cannot think about communication competence nowadays without considering CMC. It is no longer just face-to-face. It must be both face-to-face and CMC, all at the same time. They move then, this is slide 8, to communication apprehension. I don't really want to talk about this, I'm shy. Communication apprehension, big time concept. I actually wrote a paper about communication apprehension when I was in graduate school at LSU in the late 90s, and actually met he just recently passed away, McCroskey. You'll see him all over the place cited. Everybody called him Jumbo. Not necessarily because of his weight, but how highly he thought of himself. But it's a really important concept, and it's been studied a lot. But most of that stuff, the study, as I've said, has been face-to-face stuff. And again, I say see the survey and Quality Connection, so you can take your own little survey if you want to, but most of that stuff is based on face-to-face. So basically, the idea is that we need to start thinking more about communication apprehension, again, just sort of stage fright, shyness, whatever you want to call it, within the CMC setting. And so basically, and a lot of people just say CA for communication apprehension. That's why you see yet another abbreviation. I might have mentioned that already. CA, CA is communication apprehension. Generally speaking, a lot of folks see CMC as less threatening because we don't have all the nonverbals, and we're not there face to face, so we don't have the instant retribution that might happen. That's generally speaking. But then a lot of this stuff, again, is more sort of theoretical, and they don't get around to actually applying all this stuff to CMC until later on. But one of the things they talk about is this idea of situational communication apprehension versus trait-based. Situational basically means that you have apprehension in certain situations. So maybe you hate public speaking, but love group communication, or you love interpersonal communication, but you don't like group communication. So it's certain situations that might give you pause. Trait is more, I'm not a psychologist, but it's more sort of a personality-oriented, something that some people say that you are actually born with. And that's sort of the next thing. A fancy new term that perhaps you have never heard of before. And I am not an expert in this area, but it's really, really interesting. It's just really, folks just really started doing this within the last 20 years or so. It's called the communobiological paradigm. So it's basically looking at how our communication patterns or whatever are actually linked to our biology. And I'll let you read some of the specifics there, but it talks about the systems in the brain and how all that might function to create a sense of communication apprehension. The behavioral inhibition system, the behavioral activation system. Long story short, and I would say a lot of communication apprehension is socialized. Though I certainly agree that a lot of it is could be possibly trait, it could be biological. But again, this is more theoretical than anything else. The next slide, then, slide 9, they finally sort of get into what all this means for CMC. So basically they say, okay, here's all this theory about communication apprehension, but it's basically about face-to-face communication. We need more research into what they call CMCA, or computer-mediated communication anxiety. And they also talk about this very notion of computer anxiety. As you know, some folks just are scared of the technology. They don't want to do it. They've never done it before, sort of just scared of the unknown. Sometimes it's generational stuff, you know, but that's not always the case. I actually gave a presentation to a group of senior citizens, or whatever the term should be now, the older people who are older than other people, about using CMC. And a lot of them are just scared. It's like, oh, this is too hard to figure out. But I talked about stuff and maybe getting on Facebook. I told them it would be a good way. They could follow their grandchildren or something like that, if their grandchildren would accept them as friends. But I actually have a lot of, as I told you, my mother is on Facebook and we text a lot. And I actually have a great uncle who's, God, I think he's 180, and he's on Facebook. I tried to get my grandmother on Facebook, but she wouldn't. All my grandparents are passed away now, but you know, she still uses the typewriter. My dad doesn't do any of this stuff. He'd rather. When I remember I talked to my grandmother. She passed away a couple of years ago. My paternal grandmother, but she was still, you know, she lived until she was like 96 or something like that, and so she was around when they got their first telephone and first TV and all that type of stuff. But she was still, you know, amazed at the technology of the telephone. I'd talk to her. She goes, "Wow, It's amazing. It's as if you're in the next room.